hello, everyone. This is Rebecca Sive, a guest with Sophie and Kelly on the Voter In segment of Two Broads. And welcome to this show. We're really excited about doing this. We're hoping that you'll find it interesting and valuable and inspirational. And most important, we're looking forward to sharing what we know and working together to make this dream of voting in our next woman president come true. So let your friends know, welcome, and let's get going. Thanks.
Are you la la listening?
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics. We're here for our third installment of the Vote Her In segment of the podcast. Joining me today is my co-host Sophie. Hey Sophie.
Hey Kelly.
And our partner on this project, Rebecca Sive. Hi Rebecca.
Hi, glad to be here.
Yeah, thrilled to have you. So we're at the third installment here. So last time around, if you haven't listened yet, we talked about the early history of women running for president in the U.S. And now we're going to talk about sort of the next section of time. So post Gracie Allen, pre Hillary Clinton. And I think we're talking about this in general because we think it's really important information, but it's very fitting, of course, that we're doing this during Women's History Month. So the next big installment will be Hillary Clinton, and we'll talk about that in some detail. So we'll end right before that for this one. So let's talk then. Let's sort of start in on what we're talking about here. Last time we talked about some really early people who ran, and one of the points we made was that they were running in sort of independent or third party kind of races. And so now we're looking at people who actually were running for major party nominations. What do we think is sort of the important thing to think about in that?
So, yeah, that's the big difference kind of mid-century of the 20th century, although it is important to note that a number of women throughout the 20th century did seek nominations for smaller parties where, you know, there was probably little expectation of even getting on the ballot, but they did set forth and express a point of view, and I think it's important for us to acknowledge that group of women too. But you're right, starting in 1964, actually, with Margaret Chase Smith, women have run in the major party primaries or sought the nomination or been placed in nomination. And I think a lot of us know about Shirley Chisholm in 1972, and I guess we'll talk about her in a minute. But the first person was Margaret Chase Smith, a Republican from Maine, and her story was initially kind of akin to, you know, a lot of women's experience in elected office, which is that, you know, they took a seat that their husband had held or something like that. And in her case, that was the truth, the case for her. But what also happened was she then started to run herself. And she is the first woman who, in her own right, served in both the Congress and the Senate in the United States successfully for, you know, several decades. And after asking the party to consider her as the Republican nominee, they rejected her and she ran anyway. So she's really an amazing figure, both for her courage electorally and also, as we were talking about a minute ago, for her courage on some issues that resonate today. So I was really glad when I was writing Voter In and looking at all this, you know, to sort of study up on her because I didn't know everything about this, and it was just incredible.
My favorite thing about her, I think, when she announced that she was running for president, she said, "I have few illusions and no money, but I'm staying for the finish. When people keep telling you you can't do a thing, you kind of like to try."
Exactly.
It's like, yes, you are my kind of, she was a Republican, but she's my kind of woman.
Right.
Well, I thought it was interesting that she's from Maine. I feel like Maine has a type, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Maine has bent towards moderate Republican female senators. I mean, they have Olympia Snowe, they have Susan Collins, who is not as moderate as she likes to believe, but still somewhat moderate within the Republican Party. I think it's interesting that Maine is sort of the home of the moderate Republican female senator.
Yeah, I grew up in a Democratic family, and so, Margaret Chase Smith was sort of out there on the periphery when we would sit at the dinner table and discuss things. But I do recall my parents, who were, stalwart Democrats, giving her propers, right? Because of what you're saying, that she was moderate, she stood up, for certain important things, and in their minds, most importantly, stood up against Joe McCarthy in the early 50s and all the kind of red baiting activity that he fostered. So when I was reading and writing for Voter In, I found this quote from what Smith called her declaration of conscience when she spoke out against McCarthy. And I thought it was so pertinent today and what the candidates today think about and what they're speaking against, because she said her basic principles of Americanism were the right to criticize, the right to hold unpopular beliefs, the right to protest, and the right of independent thought. And then she went on to say the exercise of these rights should not cost one single American citizen his reputation or right to a livelihood. And I mean, here we are, right? Fast forward, this was said in 1950.
Yeah, and so Margaret Chase Smith was in 64, and so it had taken a long time to get from sort of the early run to then. But then we actually, not that much later, had another woman running for president who a lot more people who listen have probably heard of, Shirley Chisholm. And this is particularly amazing that Shirley Chisholm ran not just, only one of the first few women to run, but of course the first African-American woman to run for president all the way back in 1972.
And this is the story that I think, as you said, a lot of us see and hear about Shirley throughout the year, but certainly during Women's History Month. But she just sort of embodies, right, that courage and that belief in herself and that, figuring out a way where there's no way. And I actually was in college at the time, and I remember hearing about her. And then the other day, I just happened to be talking to a friend, and she said that Chisholm came to her college. This is in Minnesota, speaking of M states, and she spoke. And Linda said it was unbelievable, that she was so inspiring. And so I think that what I look to with her is that model for courage. But the other thing about her that's important, and I think relates to the current, the candidates, at least on the Democratic side, is she was really smart about policy. And so, for instance, when she was, as a member of Congress, appointed to the Ag Committee, she sort of made some reference to the fact that there weren't a lot of trees in Brooklyn, which is, where her district was, but then sought out advice and was one of the people on that committee responsible for developing the food stamps program, because that was in the purview of agriculture. So it's just this brilliant example, right? Not only of courage, but of policymaking.
And we have an echo of what Margaret Chase Smith said when she said she was running. Chisholm said she ran for office in spite of hopeless odds to demonstrate the sheer will and refusal to accept the status quo. Mm-hmm. I love it. I love these women. I'm going to get those quotes tattooed, I think.
Right. Another T-shirt in your future, right?
Yes. One thing I will note about Shirley Chisholm, too, is as far as I can tell, there is no kids' book about her. Sophie and I were actually saying maybe we should write one, because this is a huge oversight, I think, in the children's publishing industry.
Oh, that's an interesting point. Hard to imagine, but there you are. There could also be more than one, right? She deserves at least one.
Yes, for sure.
One of the things I think I was thinking about, looking at Chisholm and then sort of what happened next, was that there was a set of women over the next couple of decades. And unlike the women we were talking about a moment ago who were really engaged with these smaller parties, these are women who had significant political and governmental experience in sort of the mainstream. And there's several of them, but Moseley Braun, of course, from Illinois, from Kelly's Neighborhood, Michelle Bachmann in 2012, and Pat Schroeder in 1988. And then the last one I would mention is Patsy Mink, who actually ran on a peace platform as a member of Congress from Hawaii, also in 1972 when Chisholm was running. And the thing that struck me about these women is, as I said, they were right there in the mainstream. They had something to say. They were able to be heard, right, because they had that platform. And at least for some of us, coming of age, for instance, in the 80s and 90s, we heard Pat Schroeder talk about equal pay, for instance, and we heard Moseley Braun talk about, what it was like to be the, only African-American woman who had ever been elected to the U.S. Senate. And these were sort of important guideposts. And I imagine for younger women who've read about them or heard about them from their moms or whatever, that served them as well.
We've been talking about people running for president, but I wanted to talk a little bit about Geraldine Ferraro, who was actually the nominee for vice president in 1984. Mm-hmm. And the reason I want to talk about her is because even though I was born a few months after the 1984 election, so I wasn't even alive when she ran, but she loomed really large in my childhood. Growing up as a little girl who grew up wanting to be involved in government and being interested in politics, she sort of was talked about a lot to me, both by sort of detractors as, look at what happened to Geraldine Ferraro, and also sort of as almost like a token sometimes, like, oh, well, you shouldn't complain about things because Geraldine Ferraro got to run for vice president. But when I was looking, I was researching her a little bit more for the podcast. Another thing that I think is interesting about her is that her run, a lot of the things that happened to her and around her during her run sort of presaged what would happen later to Hillary Clinton. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about her campaign. Mm-hmm. And I know, Rebecca, you had mentioned you were involved in that as well.
Yeah, I think, what happened at that time was there appeared to be an opening for perhaps promoting a woman. And there's a group of women in Washington, colleagues of mine, and who were people involved in NARAL and the National Women's Political Caucus, who really kind of just looked at the women who were in Congress at that time and said, let's try to make something happen. And they did. There's wonderful story about this, as I recall, in Time magazine, which kind of just told how this all happened. And so then, Walter Mondale did choose Jerry, and when we got to the Democratic Convention, some more of us, myself included, were sort of helped out a bit. And I actually remember the other day, I'm going to get it and send it to you. Maybe you can share it on Twitter. I have this wonderful caricature that was done of Jerry, with a thank you on the bottom that I have kept all these years. But the thing about her that my friends, when they initially had this idea, remarked was how feisty she was. And that goes to what you were saying, Sophie, earlier about the experiences she had that were so similar to what Hillary subsequently had. She was tough, and she saw something she wanted to do, and she realized there were perhaps some downsides that would cause some negative press, but, she went for it. I would also say one other thing, that kind of like the Hillary story, Jerry was charming, warm, funny, a mom who loves her kids, all those kinds of things that we, too rarely see. So I'm glad to hear that people talked about her with you and that you knew about her, because she was something else.
Apparently, her campaign also led to the adoption of more people using the honorific Ms., for which I am forever grateful.
Me too.
So I guess, the story that I've read is the New York Times refused to use it for her, but William Safire, of all people, was convinced that it should be used because it wasn't appropriate to call her Miss because she was married, but it wasn't appropriate to call her Mrs. because because she didn't use her husband's last name. And so 2 years later, 2 years after she ran, the New York Times finally agreed to use Ms., which is amazing. And the New York Times has now used Ms. to refer to me. So thank you, Geraldine Ferraro.
I just thought it was really interesting how parallel her, and we'll talk about Hillary Clinton in the next episode, as you mentioned, but Ferraro had sort of a quote-unquote scandal during her run, and looking back at it, it looks pretty stupid. It was like, I don't even really understand it. Her husband had tax returns, and she didn't want to release them because he had a job, and it was all like sort of this made-up scandal, but it turned out to be, apparently there was a study that said it turned out to be the most talked about issue in the 1984 campaign. And that sort of reminded me of the way that the Hillary Clinton quote-unquote email scandal became this huge thing that people focused on so much in 2016, and now we look back at it and we're like, why was that a big deal?
Well, and it's kind of two sides to the coin. On the one side, you don't want anything that sort of gives people negative views if you can possibly help it. But on the other side, it's pretty unlikely that that's going to happen for anyone, right? So the question is, how do we as, concerned voters and concerned advocates, how do we make sure that these women candidates get equal treatment, right? Even if it's in the context of review of stuff that might not be so hot, right? Not disproportionate treatment on, whatever their, faults may be or things they did that some people may not agree with. And to me, that's the really large issue here. And as you point out, the email thing looks small by comparison to what's going on. On the other hand, I would say that if something like that arises with one of the current women candidates, it'll get blown out of proportion too, and it'll be up to us to sort of say, no, let's take the measure of everyone equally.
Yeah. So speaking of scandal-ridden female VP candidates, the last person we should talk about is Sarah Palin. I think one of the things I think about with this, and of course this is the one that probably most people listening are most familiar with, is just how it was a terrible choice. I think McCain made a terrible choice. His advisors advised him terribly. But I do think it's interesting that even the Republican Party of 2008 thought that electorally it was important to have a woman on the ticket and that would help them. And I think that shows how far we've come, despite her not being a very good example of a woman and perhaps actually setting us back.
I think that when you think about it, between 1992, which was, the so-called, first year of the woman, right, when 6 women were elected to the Senate, and then 16 years later, there we are at Sarah Palin. You're right. There were all of these years to see these women and increasing numbers of them over that period being elected and seeing their ability to serve and their ability to make policy. And so I don't know what was in John McCain's mind or his advisors' minds, but it was clear that in that time period, American women had this chance to really demonstrate their fitness, for office and their leadership in big federal offices. So perhaps that was, one of the factors. I think also the case was that he knew he was up against someone who was a really compelling candidate and, let's think out of the box here, right? Which they certainly did.
Well, and Sarah Palin was actually initially a popular choice. It just happened that she wasn't very well vetted, and so after a couple of weeks, people figured out that she wasn't a good choice. But initially, she was very popular on the Republican ticket.
Yeah.
Well, and there's always the assumption, that and kind of the sort of that can be said that, well, vice president, what does a vice president really do? So if the decision is we need to do something different, we need to portray ourselves differently, that's been a route that presidential campaigns have gone down. I guess the good news is that in that case it included, a woman as it had in 1984. And now it's like no big deal, right? So... I mean, we heard Cory Booker the other day, right?
Yeah.
When asked this question, he said, well, of course I would be looking at the women first, were I the nominee.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think if we have a man who's the nominee for president this year on the Democratic ticket that they can not select a woman as VP. It'll be interesting to see.
Well, so I was sort of thinking as we're closing this phase of our discussion that we should just kind of take a moment to celebrate where we're at, right? We're midstream in Women's History Month, and of course every month should be Women's History Month, but, here we are, right? And there are all kinds of women out there doing all kinds of good things. We've seen what, women have built in terms of presidential campaigns. So I'm actually really glad we're going to conclude the month with Hillary, because I think that a closer look at, what happened with her both in 08 and 16 is going to give us a really good sort of framing, for what we look at going forward and as we look at, the candidates that are in front of us. I would just say one other thing related to it, which is that in our last episode, we talked for a moment about the fact that two African-American women had been selected to be the final candidates in the mayoral runoff here in Chicago, and we're now 2 weeks closer to that, and we're really seeing them also sort of stand up and say what they think, as well as tough it out. So I think that we're in a good place to just learn a lot about what it takes for women to lead, particularly as executives.
Yeah, and I think it's so important that when you have a lot of women running as opposed to just sort of the one token woman, that you can judge them on the merits, right? So we in Chicago now have a chance to decide between two terrific African-American women and decide which one we want and not worry about, am I making the vote that's going to make history? Either one of those votes is going to make history.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I'm so glad you said that. Because it's just a moment of wonderful, I hesitate to use the word triumph, but it really is a triumphant moment for all the women, who've worked so hard for us to get to this place.
All right. Well, so we're going to wrap up this. As I mentioned, this is the third installment, and we will continue to move forward. Next time, talking about Hillary. Hillary, if you're listening and you want to come on the podcast, you have the forever open invitation. I will fly to New York State to interview you. But for everyone else, if you didn't check out the first two installments, please do. If you go to twobroadstalkingpolitics.com/voteherin, you can find all of our Vote Her In episodes, and we will continue talking about this. It's so important, and we're all so very, very excited right now about the state of politics for women in this country.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kelly and Sophy. I look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
The Vote Her In segment is a collaboration of Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Our theme song is called Are You Listening off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.